I'm Meg, I'm an amateur historian, and welcome to my booktube channel. Today's video is my May reading wrap-up. I had a pretty good reading month, all things considered, and it's all due to the fact that I finished my thesis on May 1st, and so the rest of the month was just grading papers and doing the revisions that I had to do, which were like really minor revisions. And so I had a lot more time to read than I'm used to, which is really exciting. So I read 7 books this month, which was pretty good, and I actually really enjoyed most of them. So let's just jump right in. The first book I read was The Brain Defense, Murder in Manhattan, and the Dawn of Neuroscience in America's Courtrooms by Ken Davis. This book was a book that I read for Book Riot's Read Harder Challenge for the prompt, read a book about true crime, and I was kind of playing fast and loose with using this book for this prompt because it really is more about neuroscience than it is about true crime, but you know, it's a challenge, you pick whatever you want to do, however you want to do it, and that's what I decided to do for this one. In this book, Ken Davis uses the story of Herbert Weinstein as a kind of case study to look at this wider phenomenon of using neuroscience in America's courtrooms. In the early 1990s, Weinstein got into a fight with his wife and threw her out of their 14th story New York apartment building window. He had shown no history of violent crime. He and his wife got on really well, according to all their friends and family. This seemed really out of character for Weinstein, and during the trial, his defense lawyers pointed out that a benign cyst was growing in his brain, pushing against the part of the brain that is responsible for decision making, and they tried to use this as the rationale for why he committed the crime that he did to argue that he should be found not guilty. And this was Davis's way to enter into this wider discussion about the use of neuroscience in America's courtrooms. I have to say that I thought that I was going to be more interested in this book than I was. It was lauded as being really readable, really interesting, and it was really readable. Davis does a great job of talking about neuroscience, but I'm just not as interested in neuroscience as I kind of thought I might be. I don't know. The Read Harder Challenge is all about expanding your boundaries and reading things that you wouldn't have read before. So I definitely wouldn't have read this, and now I know that I'm not as interested in neuroscience. I gave this book 3 stars, but I think that has more to do with my personal preference than it does with the actual quality of the book itself. And if that's something you think you're interested in, I would definitely recommend reading this book. The next book I read was Language of Thorns, Midnight Tales and Dangerous Magic by Leigh Bardugo. This is a series of fairy tales set in the Grishaverse, which Leigh Bardugo created. She's also the author of the Grishaverse trilogy and the Six of Crows duology. I read this right after I finished the Grishaverse trilogy, and I loved it. It was so good. Her stories are so interesting. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, and the only reason I didn't give it 5 stars right off the bat was I think that one of Leigh Bardugo's strengths is character building, and it's really hard to build really compelling characters in fairy tales, basically. The fairy tales are meant to be more about learning a lesson or talking about life than they are about building characters. And so that was the only reason why I didn't get 5 stars, but still really loved this book. It was so interesting. She has 7 fairy tales in here, and she separates the fairy tales by culture. So each set of fairy tales is basically a fairy tale that the children of the cultures that Leigh Bardugo has created in her universe would have heard growing up. So she has as many fairy tales. She has a couple of Ravkan fairy tales. She has a Fjerdan fairy tale. And it was super cool to see those in here. And now I'm really looking forward to going back and rereading all of her other books to see if, you know, these things are mentioned. My 2 favorite stories in here are The Witch of Duva, which was a Ravkan fairy tale, and When Water Sang Fire, which was a Fjerdan fairy tale. And When Water Sang Fire in particular was really interesting to me, not just because of the story, but because it's about mermaids, and the mythology that Leigh Bardugo creates around mermaids is so fascinating. I'm not really a mermaid person. That's not something I go and seek out, but her world building around mermaids in this story was so interesting. I told her on Twitter, if you ever want to, you know, expand this into a book or a movie or another series, I would be super interested and I would pick it up in a heartbeat. She said she's not going to, but I'm gonna hold out hope because I would be super interested in reading more. I also have to say it's the most beautiful book I own. Like, this is the dust jacket, so that's already beautiful. And then the cover is gorgeous and so shiny, and the illustrations are fantastic. I have to show you my favorite illustration from The Witch of Duva. Like, look how beautiful that is. If anybody knows where I can get prints of the illustrations in here, if they exist, I want to hang this on my wall. I love this. But all of the artwork is really beautiful like that. And she kind of like has artwork around the pages too, which is just gorgeous. The next book I read was The Romanovs, 1613 to 1918 by Simon Sebag de Montefiore. Montefiore? It's one of those, I think. I read this book as kind of a team buddy read with Kate at Kate Hickey, and I also read it as part of Book Riot's Read Harder Challenge, fulfilling the prompt to read a book set in one of the 5 BRICS countries. I also gave this one 3 out of 5 stars, just like with The Brain Defense. I think this had more to do, I know this had more to do with my personal preference than it did with the quality of the book itself. The book was solely about the Romanov dynasty, and it just went from the first Romanov in 1613 to the last set of Romanovs in 1918, and described each monarch in detail and kind of their family life in detail. And that's not the type of history that I really enjoy. In the introduction, he made it seem like it was going to be more of a big picture retelling, so talking about the Romanovs, of course, but also talking about how each Romanov ruler impacted current contemporary Russia in some way, or the character of Russia in general. And he did a little bit of big picture stuff at the very end, which I thought was really interesting, but most of it was just like a real in-depth detail of every single Romanov for 300 years. And it was a lot. So if you're interested in that type of history and you're really gung-ho about learning about all of the Romanovs, I would really recommend this 657-page book to you. If you're only interested in certain Romanovs, I would really recommend individual chapters of this 657-page book. I also have to say that I had a little bit of an issue with the way that he dealt with some concepts regarding gender and sexuality, and the way that he dealt with the gender and sexuality of some of the Romanovs and their friends and whatever. Again, might just be a personal preference thing, but this book was published in, I think, 2016. It's not like this was written in the 1990s when these conceptions were completely different. This was published like a couple years ago, so I feel like he should have had somebody telling him like, hey, maybe you should word it this way instead, or say this. I don't know. Again, might just be a personal preference, but 3 out of 5 stars. Decent, but not amazing. The next book I read was The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I listened to this as an audiobook, and I loved this. I loved this. I've read Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch as well, and I didn't love The Goldfinch, so I wasn't expecting to love this one, but I did. This book follows the main character, Richard, who has moved from California to go to school at a small liberal arts college in Vermont, and he really wants to take these Greek classes. The professor only teaches 5 students, and so it's a really, really exclusive, intimate kind of club if you can get into these classes, and he ends up getting into them. And this book is all about the personal interactions among this group and how they deal with the major conflict, which is that they murder one of the people in the group. And that's not a spoiler, because she tells you at the very beginning of the book that they murder one of the characters. This character is named Bunny. And then you meet him like a couple chapters later. And I think that's part of what made this book so great to me, is that she tells you what happens at the beginning, but you don't know why they do this. And so the whole book is kind of her leading you on, so you know why they killed this person that they're supposedly great friends with, and how they deal with the fallout of that. The only reason I didn't give it a full 5 stars and I took off that little half star, it's really nitpicky. There were some things she did with characters in the second part of the book that I didn't think was necessary, but again, that's being really nitpicky. I really, really enjoyed this book. The next book I read was The Diviners by Libba Bray. This is the first book in the Diviners series, and I read this also for Book Riot's Read Harder Challenge, which the prompt for this was, read the first book in a young adult series that is new to you. I have to say, I was expecting to love it and be super engrossed, and it wasn't as engrossing as I thought it was going to be. So this book starts off by following one particular character, Evie O'Neill, who moves from her home in Ohio to New York City because she has this kind of special power. So she moves to New York to live with her uncle. And while she's there, she has to use her powers to help her uncle solve this murder, basically. And in addition to meeting Evie, you also meet a bunch of other characters that also have powers, and they're collectively known as diviners. So diviners have popped up in history before, but haven't popped up in a long time, and a particular event kind of brings a bunch of diviners out of the woodwork. And like I said, I expected to love it, and I didn't. I enjoyed it, but I didn't absolutely love it. And I think that kind of disappointment is reflected in the rating. I gave it 3.5 stars out of 5. The biggest issue that I had with this was there were some parts of her writing that were not good. And it wasn't just stylistically. There was some stuff that she did that should have been caught in the editing process that wasn't. She tells the story from multiple points of view, and she separates each point of view with a little starburst. So you know when the starburst appears, there's a jump in scenes, there's a switch in perspective, something along those lines. But every once in a while, she'll switch perspective in the middle of one of those sections without using a starburst. And it just made it very confusing to read because you're thinking from Evie's point of view, and then all of a sudden Jericho's thoughts are coming in. I found it hard to really enjoy the book the way that I wanted to when I was distracted by this element of her writing. Also, I feel really bad about this. I wish I'd read this series before I read the Raven Cycle series, because they don't have a similar plot or storyline or characters or anything like that, but they're thematically very similar. And I think Maggie Stiefvater does it better. Sorry, that's just how I feel about it. I liked it. I will be reading more of the books because, again, people keep raving about them, but yeah, 3.5 stars. Sorry. The next book I read was The Sisters Brothers by Patrick deWitt, and this one I read for the Read Harder Challenge prompt of read a Western. Oh my god, I read so many Read Harder books this month. That was an accident. I did not mean to do that. I'm not really a huge fan of Westerns and the Western genre, and actually even that like time period in history and that part of the United States during that time period in history. So I was a little bit, I wouldn't say nervous, but I was a little bit like about having to read a Western for the Read Harder Challenge. And I was like, okay, if I'm gonna have to read a Western, I'm gonna find a Western that's not like a traditional Western. And so this one has elements of a traditional Western. It deals with some of the same tropes, but it's a little bit different, and it's a little bit of a quirky take on the traditional Western. So you follow these two brothers, Charlie and Eli's sisters, so that's why they're called the Sisters Brothers, and they're basically hired guns, and they're sent by their boss to go murder somebody. This book is about their journey from Oregon to the Gold Hills of San Francisco in California to basically murder this person and the shenanigans they get into along the way. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, again partially just because I'm not super interested in Westerns, but this was a really enjoyable Western. I read this Western in particular because I know that there's a movie coming out, I think it's either later this year or early next year, with Joaquin Phoenix and John C. Reilly playing the Sisters Brothers. And the story is told from John C. Reilly's character's perspective, and so I think what helped me like this book so much is I kept picturing John C. Reilly doing all these things and saying all these things. I think that's part of why I enjoyed it more than I would enjoy other Westerns. The next book I read was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I read this as part of like a friend group book club thing, and in this book we follow a young woman, probably in her late teens or early 20s, whose name we never actually learn, who meets a widower while she's working for another woman on a holiday in Monte Carlo. And this man is about 20 years older than her. He's been married before to a woman named Rebecca. They're on holiday for a few weeks and they really get to know each other, and he asks her to marry him and then like whisks her away back to Manderley, his home in England. And she's initially very happy, she's excited, she loves this man, but she finds that she can't really get away from the memory of Rebecca because the house is filled with things that Rebecca put there, and every person that she meets kind of either compares her to Rebecca or mentions Rebecca in passing, and the book is about her marriage to this man and kind of dealing with this lingering presence of Rebecca. I really liked this book, and I didn't think that I was going to. Objectively, her life is really boring. She spends a lot of her time kind of wandering around the house. There are a lot of introspective scenes where she imagines the people, what the people around her are doing, or what Rebecca would have done in her situation. And so on the face of it, it doesn't seem like it should be as compelling of a book as it is. But it really is compelling because you want to find out, why is Rebecca such a presence in these people's lives? Like, what is it about this person that made her so memorable? I don't really know how else to describe it. That's kind of the best summary that I can come up with. Again, doesn't seem like it would be very compelling, but it is very compelling. Just to give you an idea, I read about 2/3 of this book in one afternoon. I just sat in a chair for like 4 or 5 hours because I couldn't put it down. Like, I had to finish it that day. Another kind of good suspenseful, I wouldn't even call it a thriller. It's just like a suspenseful book. I did a terrible job of selling that. Please read it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It's worth it. I promise. And that just about does it for my May wrap up. I thought about also doing a June TBR, but 1, I think this video is going to be long enough already, and 2, I have not been great about strictly following my TBRs lately, so would probably end up being useless anyway. But yeah, really happy with my reading month and really looking forward to some of the books that I think I want to get to in June, but we'll see. Thank you all for watching. If you are interested in talking to me more, I will put all of my links to all of my social media down below. But for now, that's about it. So thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye!